Hello, good evening. Welcome to the W.O. Mitchell Book Prize for 2022. This prize is coordinated by the City of Calgary through a partnership with the Writers Guild of Alberta for literary achievement by Calgary authors. I want to thank Shelf Life Books for the land acknowledgement and being our co-host and techie this evening. You can find the nominees' books and many, many more at Shelf Life. Please support them. I thank all of you for joining us for this Zoom reading. Lord knows we are all tired of gazing at our weary faces and pajama bottom selves on the computer screen. My hope is that you will join us for the Alberta Literary Awards Gala on Saturday, June 11th, where the winner will be announced live in downtown Edmonton with real people dressed in real clothes, with cash bar cocktails and writer joy abound after these past couple years of sweatpants solitaire. Hallelujah. For now, please indulge us with your screen presence. Gaze at the warm sea of faces here, bask in the blue light glow of each other, and appreciate that our 3 W.O. Mitchell finalists will have to sit on pins and needles in their pajama bottoms and/or sweatpants until the Edmonton Gala. I wish all our finalists the best of writer luck. Nominated or not, anyone that sits down over the course of lonely days, long weeks, and months that inevitably extend into years by the time you get your book published, please know that this is an achievement of the rarest kind. You are a gift to behold, and I congratulate all writers. Please continue to write for those of us waiting to read, hear, and see your next book. The world needs all of you. And now to our nominees. And for our audience, pay close attention. I have a skill testing question for you. I'll give you the question now, and then I'll come back to it. What do all 3 of our finalists have in common? You can type your answers into the chat box on the right-hand side, and the winner will receive a hallowed prize. Here are our nominees in alphabetical order. Julie Sedivy for Memory Speaks on Losing and Reclaiming Language and Self, published by Harvard Press. Jaspreet Singh, yay Julie. Jaspreet Singh for My Mother, My Translator, published by Vehiculum Press. Is that right, Jaspreet? No, he's not there. That's okay. And lastly, Neil Surkan for On Becoming, published by McGill Queen's Press. All right, back to our skill testing question. What do all 3 people have in common? See if there's anybody guessing? Any guesses? Just type them into the chat box there. Nobody has a clue? For one, we know they all live in Calgary, obviously. Calgary, yes, from Calgary. Are you all left-handed? I don't think so. Look at their last names. That's one clue. Working in a second language, very good, very nice. Wow, that's a good one. All their last names start with an S. But the one I'm thinking of, and this is the one that blows my socks off, is if any of you guessed, all are immigrants, nice. If any of you guessed that they all have PhDs in common, then I will be sending you your honorary university degree out via snail mail. Congrats on being as smart as our 3 esteemed Calgary authors. This is a sophisticated, highly educated bunch who also happen to be writers. Lucky for us. Julie holds a PhD in linguistics. Jaspreet has a PhD in chemical engineering, and Neil recently graduated with a PhD in English. That should count for extra credits, or at the very least, they should get an honorary medal for perseverance in both education and writing. Well done. Double congrats to our accomplished finalists. All right. So just a couple of housekeeping things. I don't think we'll have our mics on tonight. We'll keep them off. If you have questions, we're going to have a Q&A after all the readings. Please just type your questions in as they come to you. You don't have to wait till the end. If you think of a question while a writer is reading, just throw it into the chat box and I'll check them at the end, and we'll go through and talk with our writers. Our first reader is Julie Sedivy. She is a writer, editor, and language scientist whose work ranges from scientific to the poetic and everything between. Her essays have appeared in magazines such as Nautilus, Scientific American, the Literary Review of Canada, and Politico. Together with Rona Altros, she is the editor of Waiting, an anthology of essays. Her work can be found in two other recent anthologies, You Look Good for Your Age, edited by Rona Altros, and Impact, Women Writing After Concussion, edited by E.D. Morin and Jane Cawthorne. Sedivy is a citizen of 3 countries, but now makes her home on the achingly beautiful lands of Treaty 7. Please welcome Julie.
Thank you so much, Lee. I have so many people and organizations to thank. Thank you, Shelf Life Books. Thank you, the Writers Guild, the City of Calgary. And thanks also to the Alberta Foundation for the Arts, whose financial support made it possible for me to, for some time, set aside activities that are a little bit more lucrative than book writing and take the time I needed to research and write this book. And I really want to thank my co-finalists, Neil and Jaspreet. I feel such affinity for both of your books. I think that trying to write is a little bit like trying to take a big elephant and squeezing it through a narrow doorway. You're trying to take some raw experience and translate it into words. And I am just in such admiration of the skill of both Neil and Jaspreet in doing that. Their books are beautiful, and my greatest regret that we're not doing this in person is that I can't get your autographs to sign my copies. And I also want to point out, this is the first time that I've gone first in alphabetical order in anything. So this is the benefit of being among a group of S-named people. So my book, Memory Speaks, is kind of about living between worlds. I think that's true for so many people in Canada who feel that they have a home in more than one culture and language. And to a large extent, it's about the struggle of trying to keep the mainstream language, which is so big and so powerful, from drowning out the other parts of yourself. We really see this struggle in language. There's enormous challenges of keeping minority and heritage languages alive. We see this with the threat that Indigenous languages face. Canada is home to more than 70 Indigenous languages, and many of them now have very few speakers. But even in immigrant families, you see these pressures where it's very difficult for families to keep their heritage languages passed down from one generation to another. I think many people don't realize that even in places like Miami and Los Angeles, the chances that a Spanish-speaking grandparent will have a grandchild who can speak to them in the same language are very, very small, which really, I think, speaks to the inundating force of the mainstream language. So this book is kind of an exploration of some of those pressures and their consequences. In it, I've tried to bring in a large body of research that I think sheds light onto why this happens and how to try to maintain a language in the face of it. But I also wanted to braid that research together with personal stories and try to give a living emotional account of what it's like to try to keep yourself whole when you're made of multiple parts. So what I'm going to do is read from the middle of the book, the beginning of chapter 3. And this chapter is called Duality. I remember the first time I became aware of a split vision. of being able to shift perspectives between Czech and Canadian cultures. I was 9 years old, and it was Easter time. Czechs have a rather singular Easter tradition, whose origin is mysterious to me. It's customary for the boys and men to make whips out of willow twigs braided together and whip, usually gently, all the girls and women they meet on Easter Monday. In return, the girls give them colored eggs. And if they have especially warm feelings toward the male at the operating end of the whip, they attach a festoon of ribbon onto the end of his instrument. In some villages, the females also get a proper drenching when buckets of cold water are thrown on them. In theory, this treatment is supposed to preserve female youth and beauty. To an outsider, the symbolism of male sexual dominance and female submission sits right on the surface. How could you possibly miss it? But like the thumping of one's own pulse, this custom was so familiar to me and my family that its symbolism was invisible. It was simply part of life's rhythms, like preparing meals and harvesting vegetables. But I remember very clearly how the year I turned 9, my father made the willow whip as usual, only to be confronted with the immovable refusal of his 3 daughters. "We're not doing that anymore, Dad." I was too young to be able to articulate any change in my views of the meaning behind the custom. But after living in Canada for several years, a different feeling had seeped into me and my sisters about the nature of a normal relationship between the sexes. All we knew was that our Easter tradition, which had once felt as natural as opening presents on Christmas, now felt deeply weird. My father, cowed, put the whip away. Many years later, when I visited my father's family in his home village after his death, it was Easter time, and I was confronted with the view from the other shore. Observing the whipping ritual, I unspooled my adult analysis of this custom for one of my female cousins, who reacted with knit brow perplexity and suggested that I had been reading too much Freud. When I challenged her to explain the custom, she said, "What's to explain? It's just a nice custom." Yes, in years past, she admitted, the boys would sometimes get carried away, and some of the older women recalled having red welts all over their thighs and legs from overly zealous Eastertime whippings in their youth. But nowadays, the women were treated gently and respectfully. "It was nice," she repeated. Later, I witnessed the same cousin receiving guests at her house and turning around at the door to present her buttocks to the visiting males for a gentle swat with the willow whip. When I stopped by the home of another cousin that afternoon, I was similarly swatted by all 3 of her teenaged sons, none of whom had met me before, but who addressed me deferentially with the formal V rather than T, both before and after my whipping. The ritual still felt strange. But it also felt, and this may be a little hard for a non-Czech to understand, a little festive, all the more so for being a bit bizarre. Throughout my visit to my father's village, I was constantly reminded of how my life had been defined by these swings of perspective, of the potential for the invisible and the unnoticed to appear deeply odd, even aberrant, when looked at from a different slant, of the way that something mundane suddenly leaps into view and demands an explanation. I became aware of the flipping of my own perspectives from Czech to North American and back again. After a while, it becomes possible to flip between viewpoints at will. I'm far from alone in this. There's a flash of recognition that often passes between those of us who were born on the shores of one world, but have planted the leading foot onto the banks of another. What defines us better than the very state of straddling, of divided perception, regardless of which particular worlds bisect our consciousness? As a member of this club, this assembly of migrants, minorities, and other misfits, I immediately recognized the Vietnamese American protagonist of Viet Thanh Nguyen's novel, The Sympathizer, as one of us, right from the opening lines. I am a spy, a sleeper, a spook, a man of two faces. Perhaps not surprisingly, I am also a man of two minds. I am not some misunderstood mutant from a comic book or a horror movie, although some have treated me as such. I am simply able to see any issue from both sides. Sometimes I flatter myself that this is a talent, and although it is admittedly one of a minor nature, it is perhaps also the sole talent I possess. At other times, when I reflect on how I cannot help but observe the world in such a fashion, I wonder if what I have should even be called a talent. After all, a talent is something you use, not something that uses you. Another member of the Split Selves Club, along with Nguyen and his two-faced protagonist, is Eva Hoffman, Polish emigre and author of the memoir Lost in Translation. Hoffman's trajectory is eerily similar to my own. She and her family fled their native Eastern European country for Canada when Hoffman was an adolescent. Like me, she completed her education in the United States and launched her career there. Just as familiar to me as the details of her migration is the chronic sense of double vision that she threads throughout her entire memoir. In one poignant passage, she describes her Polish and North American selves vying for influence over her major life decisions. Should you marry him? The question comes in English. Yes. Should you marry him? The question echoes in Polish. No. But I love him. I'm in love with him. Really? Really? And thus ensues a volley between her two halves, with her North American inner voice dwelling on her boyfriend's husbandly qualities, and her Polish voice insisting that she feels no creaturely warmth for him, warning that ambivalent feelings are not a sign of maturity, but a harbinger of impending dissatisfaction in love. Later, the whole dialogue reprises. Should you become a concert pianist? The question comes in English. No, you mustn't. You can't. Should you become a pianist? The question echoes in Polish. Yes, you must, at all costs. The costs will be too high. The costs don't matter. Music is what you're meant to do. Don't be so dramatic. I can play for myself, for pleasure. And so it goes. For those who experience themselves as divided, the separate selves are often anchored to separate languages, as they were for Eva Hoffman. Many people who speak more than one language express the feeling that they're somehow different people in each of their languages. In fact, when researchers asked more than 1,000 bilingual and multilingual people whether they felt this way, 2/3 of them replied that they did. And to find out why that is and what to make of it, you'll have to read the book.
Excellent. Thank you, Julie. I had read that passage prior to you telling me what you were reading, and I was howling over the Easter whippings because at first I was horrified, and then, like you, when you examined it within the culture, it makes sense, and it is festive and fun, right? Yeah, that was great. Thank you very much, Julie.
Thank you.
All right. Please, everybody, if you have questions for Julie, throw them in the chat now, because then we'll address them at the end. I've also I've cut and pasted the jurors' comments for Julie's book in the chat box now. So when you get a chance, have a look at those. I'm going to do it for each of our writers, as opposed to reading it out. So take a look and Writers, if you haven't seen it, take a look as well. Thank you, Julie. All right, next up is Jaspreet Singh. His nonfiction has appeared in Granta, Brick, Alberta Views, and the New York Times. He is the author of the novels Chef, Face, and Helium, the short story collection 17 Tomatoes, the poetry collection November, and most recently his memoir, which is nominated, My Mother, My Translator. His work has garnered many awards and been published internationally and has been translated in several languages. Please welcome Jaspreet Singh.
Well, thank you, Lee, for such a generous introduction. I'm a great fan of your work, and thank you. And I would like to thank the organizers of the event, Shelf Life Bookstore. I understand that the day for the independent bookstores in Canada is on the 30th of April, something like that. Yeah, my favorite bookstore in Calgary, Shelf Life Bookstore. I would like to thank Writers Guild of Alberta, the City of Calgary W.O. Mitchell Prize jury for the shortlist. I don't know the jury members, but thank you so much for this particular shortlist. And I would like to congratulate Julie and Neil for writing very moving works. And I echo Julie's thoughts when she says that there is this tremendous affinity between these three works. So I'm going to read a bit non-linearly today. This is, after my book launch, this is the first reading I am doing. And the book launch has the title story, My Mother, My Translator. I think it is archived, so I won't repeat that. And for this particular event, I have decided to read a few fragments to give you an idea about the book. And I have retitled these fragments. The first one is called Stories, Silences, and Translation. To tell a story means to translate the original, and the original, as the writer Borges said, is never faithful to the translation. I grew up with two master storytellers, Bapaji, my maternal grandfather, and Ma, my mother. Bapaji's stories wove together science, poetry, travel, memoir, biography, Punjabi mavericks, polyglot utterances, totke, sakhi, kisse, kahani, var, gatha, myth, and objects. At times, he narrated a bit like he would help me with science projects, telescope, microscope, kaleidoscope, changing and wiping the lenses carefully with a special cloth of associations and digressions. Sometimes he startled the listener with the sudden appearance of Dalton or Darwin, a fossil, an earthquake, silkworms, bees, he would say, arrange flowers between, bees, he would say, arrange marriages between flowers. By the time I began listening to him, the stories had reduced to their essence. Most would stop and start flowing again, like all trauma stories. He spent a lot of time on the before and the after, not the horrific moment itself. The fact that he had lost both his father and mother to partition would be told so obliquely that for a long time it failed to register in my mind. Like Bapaji, my mother too would turn the wick of her life, as they say, into stories. She would blur genres. But unlike him, she had perfected the art of periscopic narration. Often she would use he said, and she said, he said, she said. And at times she would merge with or become the person whose story she was narrating. She was fascinated by narratives involving or told by ghosts. Versions of Rajani's tale, dreams, lives of poets, writers, and saints. She would slip into nearly endless memories of almost everyone in the extended family. When grandfather's stories perturbed me, Ma's would calm me down. To me and my sister, she would also tell the largely neglected stories of women in the family. Suddenly, women would acquire agency, and some of them names as well. Now and then, now that she was writing her life, I wanted to read it as closely and carefully as possible. I wanted to read Ma's memoir the way translators do. Written words can be misunderstood or used against you, and she knew that better than I did. Stories read by known and unknown readers have consequences. As a child, I noticed her emotional states, especially the ones connected to writing. Afraid someone might read her diaries, she would offer them to fire. Once, I felt like breaking our pact, the pact made with Ma. It would be good for her work if a kind stranger took over from me, I thought. But the next moment, an inner voice said, "Don't be silly." But the next moment, an inner voice said, "Ask Ma about Punjabi words for silence, silenceness, silencing, and unspeakable. Chup, chuppi, chup sadhana, chup kara dena, bolan wali gal nahi hai." Stories have consequences, but so do silences. Not just the ones about stories never told before, but also the ones connected to stories told repeatedly in the past. Please, Ma, I agree that stories could be misunderstood, but silences too could be misunderstood and twisted or distorted. On the page, she was extremely careful. Strange writer, someone who could not imagine harming others, even inadvertently. For certain, she wanted to restore damaged memories, but more than that, she wanted to make sure no one got damaged by memory. March 25th, 2013. So much dust has settled on the blades of ceiling fans. I cleaned the fan in Ma's room, felt I was finally taking care of her. November 19th, 2019. How uneven this process. Ma's life took place in Punjabi. I am writing her in English. How uneven this process. Once again, a man is writing a woman's story. Yamnuska. As one drives from Calgary to the Canadian Rockies, one encounters the near mythical Mount Yamnuska, which rises like a wall of stone. In the Stony Nakota language, the word Yamnuska comes from the flat-faced mountain. This mountain kept geologists busy trying to figure out its marvelous secret. What confused the scientists was the presence of thick layers of old rock, 550 million years old, that lay not below the deposits of young rock, 78 million years old, as expected, but right above them. Normally, old rock bears the weight of the young, not the other way around. The geologists had to wait until the arrival of the plate tectonics theory in the later half of the 20th century to understand those rocks. You and I never got a chance to hike around Yamnuska, mother of mine, not even to CAD, to the Natural History Museum, to scan the permanent exhibit. So much of our relationship belongs to the terrain of what might have been. The one lively conversation you and I had about geology involved the following sayings. The past is the key to the present. The present is the key to the past, to which you added, the past is the key to the future. The future is the key to the past. This is the third time I'm going through your objects, words, and silences. Making long lists of the strata in your house continues to comfort, helps me calm down. You know, this is not the stratigraphy I had ever imagined I would engage with, but don't worry, I'm already getting used to the encounters. Missing pages in journals, red henna bags, watermarked gutkas, gamut of bindis, grandfather's house microscope, managed chaos of aging photos, miniature plastic combs, antimony sulfide kohl surma, once worn wristwatches, archives of buttons, nail cutters, sui dagas, needles, irreversibly beautiful pashmina shawls, hyperbolic hairpins, collection of small purses, Japanese playing cards, nimble umbrellas, job resignation letter, yoga mats, things to shoo away pigeons, mounds of cable bills, unused shoes, pastel gurgabis, coat hangers, coconut oil vials, fragile books enveloped with old newspapers, Sunday visit and going home. What are these posters doing here? Transcendental vases, islands of suitcases, wedding ring, Sikh bracelet bought outside Darbar Sahib, lost necklace clusters, Nanak portrait, remnants of Chardi Kala greeting cards, bewildering unmailed letters, unsettled paperweights, haiku-sized transistor radio, skeletal photo albums, Kali Ki Panda, tin galvanized pot, Chandni Chowk Rumalas, replicates of books from Harbans Kaur Memorial Library, 7 or 8 brilliant wounds of unperishable objects that still linger in your handbag. Is this the last book you read, the last line you wrote? Laughter and forgetting. While laughing, I felt you were laughing along with the two of us. And I was again curious, when did you laugh the most of late? On the 1st of January 2012, we played a Punjabi card game after you fed my sister and her little boy and me gobi parathas. You were in the subjunctive mood, reciting your favorite verses from the Guru Granth Sahib, almost a hum. Jo tum girwar, to hum mora. Jo tum chand, to hum chakora. Jo tum diya, to hum bati. If you were the sovereign of a mountain, then I would be a peacock. If you were the moon, then I would be a chakor in love with the moon. If you were a lamp, then I would be the wick. To which I grafted a couple of lines by a contemporary poet from Chile. If you were a foot, then I would be a sock. If you were music, then I would be an ear. If you were a fried egg, then I would be a piece of bread. And the children laughed as well, and so did I, intermittently at first. And we could not stop even when the trees started swaying dangerously in the rain. The city filled up with the force and beauty of rain, and we were happy, and no one knew it was soon going to end, and we so enjoyed the rain. We so enjoyed the rain, which kept making eddies and angles, bouncing off the ground as if conveying to aggregated particles in the whole of cosmos that even the most seemingly finished things, even the most seemingly finished works, stay forever unfinished. Thank you.
Sorry about that. I had muted myself. Thank you, Jaspreet. That was lovely. What I was saying through my muted preamble was that Jaspreet is currently in Banff at the moment and was a little bit nervous that his Wi-Fi wasn't going to work. So asked me to read that particular passage in the case of an emergency. I'm glad it was you, Jaspreet. It was beautiful. Thank you. All right, our final reader for the evening is Neil Surkan. Neil was born in Penticton, BC. He is the author of the poetry collections Unbecoming, which is nominated for this prize, and On High, both from McGill Queen's University Press. And the chapbooks, they're Queer Tenderness and Supernatural. His new poem, On Homesickness, won the 2021 Riddle Fent Poetry Prize. Neil earned a PhD in English from the University of Calgary in 2021. You can learn more about what he's up to at neilsurkan.com. Please welcome Neil.
Thanks so much for having me. When I launched, especially my first book, which was called On High, I realized on the book tour that like the true pleasure of a launch and the true pleasure of any kind of a reading is just hearing the words of writers you admire in a room. And now, of course, like intrepidly in the Zoom void as well. But I'm truly agog at the readings that we've had so far. So, and I'm honored to be among you. I'd like to start by just saying that I'm reading to you currently from Nanaimo. So I'm on the unceded territory of the Coast Salish people. And I want to begin by thanking this Nunamuk, on whose traditional lands I'm learning, I'm doing some teaching, I'm parenting, writing, and, periodically growing, I think. So I'm grateful to be here. I'm so honored to be a finalist for this award. And I just want to begin once again by congratulating Julie and Jaspreet. The true savory moment for me is when I just have to pick up my pen and sketch down a line or two as they kind of trickle across the interwebs. So I've done that a few times tonight, and I think we're all really lucky to hear those readings. And I also just want to say thanks, Lee, for hosting us tonight. And thanks also to Jun. Jun, I admire you. So thank you so much for hosting me again in a shelf life space. This is Unbecoming. It came out in November, so it's still kind of fresh, but as Lee kind of remarked on at the beginning of this event, it was a long time coming at the same time. So it's like an old new thing in my hands a little bit. And I'm just really grateful to McGill Queen's University Press for supporting a second book. I'll start actually just by reading you the epigraph. And it's from the poet Jack Gilbert. I'm not sure if any of you are familiar with his work. The painful love of being permanently unhoused. This first poem is called Renfrew. Figured I should sneak in a couple Calgary poems. So here's one. It's kind of an Ars Poetica, so kind of, a little bit. Renfrew. Bungalow after bungalow, teeth on a saw. Heavy bag hung from a branch, mid-construction Zen pond. Gnomes blazing on pea gravel beside a breeze-blocked truck. Tool shed turned infrared sauna. And everywhere, the wounded smell of clipped grass. Chemical defense, distress signal to other grass. The kind of message the receiver wishes he could do something about. Guarantee his own safety or help. Poetry is such a wounded smell. At best, we feel exhilarated by our rootedness and the crude, whirling blade that moans in view, that veers without notice. Till then, feed trough planted with herbs, river stones accrued for later, wind sock swollen with the weather. As I said, this book was kind of a long time coming. So one of these poems is about grocery shopping with an infant strapped to your body, which some people didn't get to do for a couple of years, including myself. So here's an old, I guess in terms of the context, an older poem. It's called Bewilderment. Bewilderment is also the first word of the poem. Bewilderment does not become a consumer. My son, strapped to my chest, will not remember this grocery run, nor tasting this Chilean peach I'm thumbing for softness. So much displaces in the realms of produce and memory. We feel and feel till someone has to care for us. I hope he will visit. We pass the milk, the sweets, the butcher. All the while he sleeps, which strangers love, stopping to simper. I wonder if their snuffles, their pinching of wrappers, filter through his dreams, his separate dark, those ears that match my brother's. Subtler, subtler beat our hearts down aisles of cluttered glitz. So there's a long poem that starts this collection, and I always extend my gratitude to Larissa Lai for, in reading this collection, suggesting that the poem that was initially at the end be transferred to the front of the collection, because it just kind of sets the stakes in a different way. And the minimum, which is the poem, it comes out of a conversation with the artist and physician Cam Matamoros, and she discussed with me how when she was making landscape paintings, she would always wonder about the minimum she could apply to the canvas in order to create a landscape, or for it to be noted as a landscape. And her most recognizable ones, which actually look, just by coincidence, a lot like the cover of this book, are ones where she would wax her lip and then take an Anne Collier-sized gigantic photograph of it and say it was a landscape. And so that has nothing to do with the poem, but I always think of Cam when I'm kind of working toward it. So this poem is actually, it's an elegy in large part, but it's really thinking about the minimum required to kind of think about one's lineage and what is hereditary. And also alongside that, what it means to be a father. The minimum, I'll read you 4 parts. The minimum. What is the minimum required to convey a landscape, I wonder, as my father and I drive from Saskatoon to PA, and all that divides land from sky is a faint crease at road's end. Deer eyes flare, but otherwise the snow spans evenly on all sides, and it's hard to say how close we are to anything but one another. And so, being not close, I fix on lone farmhouses' slight windows, bending off the dusk like pilot lights. This is where my father's family restarted, 40 below, on a crude plot, etc. All the pioneer non-apologies, neo-peasantry, not even bootstraps to pull, become an ethics of work, survivor's pride, leisure earned, and never one to whine, feelings tucked like perch under ice, turned isolation in old age, brute stubbornness, a frail rage. He refuses to eat, Dad says. I nod and watch the mill slide past, frost glinting on fresh stacked timber. There's no time, my gowned grandfather grumps. He must get to work. His blood-logged legs make the hospital bed look heaped with twin barrows. Having decided to die, he sips less Ovaltine than would sustain a baby, drains his body gradually, a gravity flow grain elevator. Yet still, he skeptically recounts my hands when we play cribbage on his lap, probes about my degree, briskly and bewilderingly concrete, as if his mind, crisp as the sifting air outside, were simply poised to vault like a chill into new limbs and keep on without interruption. Hence the air in here, forced and stuffy as, again and again, my father asks if he has any pain, and my uncles sprinkle well wishes from church and bridge club till he practically sparkles with hard granules of sugar that begin to burn like salt on ice when, time to leave, he won't return love to any of us. Here are two sections from the latter end of the poem. What is the minimum required to convey shifted ground, I wonder, as the prop plane shrugs from a spray of de-icer? My father sits 2 rows away. At the next terminal, we separate completely with predictable words, but I can feel his generous fragility, which I mirror, being his son, though it doubles as comfort. I almost pat his back with a thud. Instead, the wound breathes. We breathe the forced air, split into the sky. When I think of my grandfather on that shabby gurney, I don't picture his face. I only see my dad and his 4 brothers thwarted by permafrost they're trying to douse for water, resorting to hurling love on the stubbled, frozen earth. Then I think of that transfer when my father wept on me. And this is the last section of the poem. The morning my son is born, dawn spreads like feeling into numb limbs, and rain, the smell of burnt sugar, soaks the rough remnants of asphalt in the lane. All I want to do is love without impediments, to live, not survive, brazenly out of focus, enough for a horizon line to thread off in the distance while we learn to walk more gingerly, watching for rivulets of ants, the squat, thick-petaled prairie crocus. I call my dad, share details, his weight, his name, how powerful his mother is, the minimum to convey amidst dogged relinquishments, the gravity of such an appearance, how much it means we get to change. It's so weird to read poems like that on Zoom. Sorry, it's just always bizarre. I'm really grateful if you can hear me that you can hear it. I'm going to read you 2 more. This one is a poem for my son. It has a misleading title, I guess, in that way. And the title is, again, the first line. My favorite death sentence is no love without threat of absence, a fragment, but nothing's perfect, and nothing is a verb. When we met, you sentenced my other lives to death. I feared nothing more, moored to your smallness. You have my likeness, but there's nothing like you, and despite nothing, you. And I'm going to end with one little poem called Infinities. Infinities. At this sharp crook in Beaver Point Road, a cumulus of blackberries frizzes with ripe fruit and veined leaves. Cars slip past like swallows in the throat, while 3 wild horses tug drooplets off the spiny boughs, their wire-twisting plier lips tenderly efficient. On this crisp July evening, they're completely ignoring me. Looking down, I suddenly notice the grasses teeming with baby toads. Thanks for listening. Thanks for having me.
That was awesome, Neil Surkan. Thank you very much. I think we made the the right choice in closing out our readings this evening with your 24-karat language. And you can thank Julie for that compliment. It's golden diamonds for sure. Thank you, all of our readers. That was terrific and so interesting to just hear different cultures, different languages, different worlds, and connected by so many things: family, language, experiences, all of that stuff. Let me have a look at our chat room, see if anybody has questions. We have a shy bunch here today. Ask us some questions, or we're going to natter on people. Does anybody have any questions they'd like to ask our readers, our writers? Pardon me. Okay, well, think about them. I have a question, actually. I thought it was somewhat serendipitous that all three of these books are written by writers that have PhDs, and I'm curious, how does your PhD inform your writing? I mean, academic writing is so different from memoir, from personal essay, from poetry. Would anybody like to speak to this? Go ahead and unmute yourselves and have a go at it. Let's put Neil on the spot. Neil. I mean,
I can't see Jaspreet, but I can see Julie went. I'll take first try anyways. But so this collection and in a different form was part of my PhD. It was the kind of creative element of my PhD. It was also accompanied by a long essay kind of on the possibilities, and this might be strange given the poems. I feel like there is affinity, and I've already defended them, so I will not defend them again for this claim. But the academic side was thinking largely about kind of the possibilities and the quandaries of activist poetry, and how intimations of personal experience, especially through like a queer lens, might be generative in an activist space. So I was kind of thinking about poets like Carl Phillips and Roy Meeke. But yeah, so like as I was reading this kind of literary theory and these poets that I admire, the poems kind of, I always think of my writing as kind of like love poems to the writers that I'm reading at a given time. And so kind of it's that kind of tenuous relationship in some ways. The one thing I will say that I just find the moment I heard this, I carried it with me forever, but it's Roy Meeke's theory often interrogates or engages with B.P. Nichols' idea of the hunch, and the hunch being first like a way of kind of crouching to get through a space, and then at the same time having like a sense, like an intuitive sense, like having a hunch, an idea, or like a kind of half formed idea. And so B.P. Nichols kind of thought about that as a way of thinking about poetry. And so like the hunch and the way we get forced through the form of the poem, or that we might enter to a relationship with form alongside like the intuitive or associative qualities. And so that kind of is at the core of my way of thinking, maybe a little bit about activism, because Meeke believes that means we can think about that being like a way of changing the world, right? Hunching anew or entering into new relationships with structure. So that's kind of where it comes from. Anyway, a long answer, did my best.
No, that's excellent. Thank you, Neil. Julie, would you like to speak to this? I mean, the PhD, obviously, yours is in linguistics.
Yeah, it is. It's a really interesting question. I think the first answer to that question is that what I bring from my PhD and from my scholarly side is patience. That's a trait that you need to develop, I think. But yeah, obviously this book incorporates a lot of linguistic research into it. But in some ways, so I think what I gained from my studies and my research life is a deep, deep respect for expertise and for knowing a subject matter very thoroughly and very deeply. That's something that just kind of gets entrenched in you when you work within an academic setting, and you learn the value of that. So that I think is something that I brought with me into this book. But in some ways, there were some impediments that I brought with me too, or some tensions maybe would be more accurate. So I think of myself as a writer as being kind of bicultural, that part of me lives in the academic world and part of me lives very much outside it. So you mentioned that academic writing is often very different from the way that these three books are written. And that's certainly true in my field. If you pick up a journal article and in my field, it's not going to read like the book that I've just written. And part of my goal here was to kind of merge those two sides of my life and the way that I've merged my Czech and Canadian sides together, and to create something that feels coherent, but that plays where plays off against the strengths of each other. So the ability of literary writing to bring emotions to life, to make an experience feel vivid, but then to ground that with a body of scholarship. And here I'm really sitting on the shoulders of many, many scholars and the deep lines of research that they've put into the earth. So yeah, this is my bicultural book.
That's excellent. I like the analogy between biculture and bi worlds, you know, academic versus literary as well, which the book is very literary and very it reads very, it's very accessible. It's very personal. Jaspreet, would you like to, does your PhD inform your writing in any particular way? Did you leave us, Jaspreet? Oh, hang on, I don't see Jaspreet here. Maybe he got disconnected. Well, shoot. Okay, we can't grill him if he's not here. It's okay. He's like he said, the Wi-Fi was a little bit glitchy up there, so we'll just move on and see if he rejoins us. When all three of us writers were talking about this event, Julie made the keen observation that all three books are concerned with translation in some form. The idea that experience gets translated into memories or stories or poems. I think we've kind of touched on this a little bit in terms of just the themes of your book, but what I'm curious about is what the initial impetus for writing this particular book was for you at this time. Neil, you talked about this as part of your PhD, is that correct?
Yeah, that was in part kind of the collection kind of was coming and going already by the time I was like enrolled in this PhD, because my first book came out about halfway through that degree, and so there's always that tension. I would be curious to hear, Julie, if you have like a similar thing with this. I always find it very challenging to start a new project when the other one is being edited or being like kind of promoted or anything like that. Like I have a hard time kind of shifting gears in a way that feels meaningful and authentic. The major impetus for writing this collection and the way it came out the way it did was when I found out that I was going to be a dad, and that kind of changed the sense of engagement with the future, and so and kind of how accountable I need, like thinking about accountability in a different way. I think beyond my lifetime became like a really generative zone that kind of informed the way that I did my research alongside this collection. Yeah, that's what I would say.
Excellent, thank you. Julie?
Yeah, so it's interesting because in a way, this book didn't really come directly out of my linguistic research or studies, in the sense that wasn't the topic of this book is not the primary topic of my research. For many years before I kind of shifted over to becoming a writer, I would spend my time in dark labs, putting eye trackers on people and watching what their eyes did as they understood language, and developing very technical and very detailed theories about, you know, what's basically happening in your mind as you try to unpack speech. And this book didn't come out of that in any direct way. it really came out of a personal experience. And that experience is one that I write about at the beginning of the book. It was prompted by the loss I felt when my father died. And as a result of his death, I felt very disconnected from Czech. He was the person with whom I had the closest connection to the language. And at that point, my connection to Czech was very, very thin. And, you know, it's just one of those realities that you don't know what you have until you lose it. Loss somehow clarifies things. And that really began my line of thinking about language loss, heritage languages, indigenous languages, and language death, and why it's such a challenge to keep our languages alive, even when they mean a lot to us. You know, they're not insignificant to us, and yet there is a tendency for them to fade away. So I wanted to understand that, and I wanted to speak to that experience. So in a way, it was an event in my personal life that kind of prompted me to dig into my familiarity with linguistic research and my ability to read that research and bring it back into the realm of personal experience. So it wasn't a natural outgrowth. Like, you wouldn't look at my academic work and say, oh yeah, that's the book she's going to write if she's going to write a book for a broader audience.
Yeah, for sure. That's interesting. I just kind of naturally assumed that it was, you know, somewhat based on your research, but you telling us what your linguistic research was, I mean, it's far beyond that and much more personal. Interesting as well. And I wish Jaspreet was here to talk with us about this Jaspreet book, just from reading some of the information around it. The impetus for him writing his particular book was after his mother passed away. Yeah. And the loss of language and culture, and just exactly what you said, Julie, you don't know what you have until it's not in front of you, right? There's something really powerful about that. Yeah. Okay, let's see. Do we have any questions? Anybody out there have any burning questions they want to ask our two writers? This is your chance. You can heckle them. You can do whatever you need to do. Yeah, I guess the other thing that I'm curious about, and I mean, I'm curious about this in my own writing, is always, how do you express the inexpressible? And this is something, thank you to Julie again, that she brought up about the commonalities of all the books. Can you talk about that? Like, how, you know, how do you how do you talk about something that has no words, or how do you get that across to someone through your poetry or your personal essays? Julie, do you want to lead us on this? Make Julie go first.
Sure, but Neil's going to be able to say so much more, because I think that, you know, he's I think among us the one who has just perfected this to such a degree. I mean, I just read through those poems and there are so many phrases that I just think like, oh, you know, I can't believe you thought to express it that way. I don't know. For me, it's a process of circling often. You know, I start with some notion and some experience. I try it out with one line, and then I just kind of circle around until it feels right. The passages that give me the toughest time, I put aside, I go for a walk, and I just let language kind of bubble around as I walk. I don't think I have a particular method. I think reading widely helps dislodge ways of expressing. I think over time I've realized that my way of expressing myself in English actually has some elements that I recognize in Slavic writers. And I think it was when I recognized that I began to sort of embrace the ways in which I think my prose is maybe different from other writers that are being celebrated, or different from ways in which I was maybe oriented to write in English. Yeah, I don't know that I have any particular insights about that other than to say that it's really, really actually hard. It's difficult. You know, I think there's often this public perception that's fueled by scenes in movies. When you see writers depicted in movies, um, they spend like 99% of their time getting drunk and having sex with random strangers, and then they have one inspired weekend and the novel pours out of them, right? It doesn't work that way, folks. It just doesn't, and it's a difficult, slow, patient process, and it's a lot of waiting, a lot of just being silent and waiting for the words to kind of form in the right ways. At least it is for me. Maybe Neil sits down in a fury of inspiration and these poems just come pouring out of him, but I kind of doubt it. So I'll let Neil tell us how he does it.
Awesome. Thank you, Julie. Neil?
Yeah, no, there have been a couple. I appreciate the poet Charles Simic talking about this. For once in a while, you get like a little glass of water poured down your back, and the whole poem, comes out in one go. That's kind of been my experience, maybe 2 or 3 times in my life. But the majority of the time, it is kind of just that kind of ruminating. That kind of work. I wrote a lot of this book in C space, so kind of close to Marta Loop there in the Southwest. I was sharing a space with Feast Letterpress, so I was surrounded by these these large, I don't know, heavy letterpressing objects, and my time in the studio was from around 6:30 in the morning till about 10 a.m. And so it was kind of that interplay between inklings, dream shreds, I guess, and just kind of that sense of there being a terminus to the time I could write in the morning before I had to share the studio space. That made it so that there was this kind of really productive pressure for me. So really it's about circumstance, and then the other side for me, a lot, especially in terms of dealing with ineffability, comes down to just relying on finding a community of readers that I really trust. So it's a very small group of dear friends that I'm really honored to share work with and to also receive work from, and those are the people that I just believe are the people I'm writing to, and that's kind of how I navigate for myself anyways, the interplay between an idea that resonates for me and an idea that might also pop into someone else's head in some form anyways, right? So, and I kind of I found I'm really grateful also for my experiences in workshops, but the work of the workshop, and when I'm teaching workshops, the same is true, is finding the audience that you might write to, right? The person to write toward, who seems to catch what you are throwing down, but also hold you accountable, right? So that's kind of always the work of it for me. There's a poem in this collection that ends with the line, "Most of a poem is almost," and I would say that is actually true for the way that the poems that I love are the ones that have that somewhat associative quality, where there's something going on and it's peripheral, and I feel compelled to return to it for years thereafter.
Excellent. Thank you. Okay, we have a question. Ian Graham would like to know, what are you all working on next? Julie?
Yeah, I am actually in the throes, hopefully in the last few months, of working on a manuscript. And this is a collection of essays. And I think of it as, the question earlier was, how does my PhD inform my work? And I have to say that the first time I taught a linguistics class, I had this funny experience. A woman came up to me after the class. She was older than most of the students. And she told me that she was not going to take the class after all, that it wasn't what she expected. It was way too technical and way too focused on dissecting language. And she said, by way of explanation, "You see, I'm a poet," as if that would explain why she wouldn't be interested in approaching language this way. And I thought, I have exactly the opposite experience, where understanding the innards of language just blows my mind. And it makes me see things in language that I never would otherwise. So this book of essays is kind of like that. It's structured along a timeline of a life, but it really traces the life of language within like a human brain, embedded a little bit within my own human brain and my particular experience. So within each essay, I explore some linguistic phenomenon that's happening at a different point in your life. So one chapter might be on how do infants know how to separate words in speech? Because we don't have pauses between words in speech. This is actually quite a puzzle. So how do they know when words begin and end? And there's a lot of research that looks into this. So I take these linguistic phenomena and just kind of explore it in a poetic, philosophical way and use that as a starting point. But it's really, the whole book is kind of about this expanded view of language that you get from knowing something, loving something thoroughly. So in a way, it's like my love poem to language. And it's been very challenging to write. I'm exhausted. My husband is exhausted. But I think it's made me into a very different kind of writer than I was when I started working on it. So I'm curious to see how it will come out.
Wow, that sounds fascinating, Julie. I want to know how babies decipher between words. I mean, like you say, that deep research, right? I mean, that's really interesting. Neil, what are you working on?
I have a title of my books always kind of revolve around the next title. I'm so sorry to those of you who are here. I'm not telling you what it is, but it must remain private at this time. But as it was with Unbecoming, like the kind of a title kind of drives is just enough of a kind of configuring I don't know, substance kind of that kind of grouts the book. So it's kind of very loose right now. It's a book of poems. Through this pandemic, I felt kind of just burnt out in a way that I hadn't expected. And I also just hadn't, I received my PhD on paper in November and just kind of continued on. And then I kind of a couple weeks ago, was just out for a walk with the dog, and there was that moment of being like, oh, that thing is done and I haven't really marked it, and kind of allowed it to be there, to be some fatigue there and also some excitement. And so that I'm just kind of enjoying writing again, really enjoying just reading new collections again. How about instead of saying what the book is, I'll just say the poets that I think are just new books that I really love. I'm reading The Past by Wendy Xu. I think it's spectacular. Paul Batchelor's book, The Acts of Oblivion, and Emily Berry's new book, Unexhausted Time. Just keeping those books close has really been what's generative at this time. And then reading, just working through some theory. Yeah, so yeah, so that's all I can say at this time, but I think it will be a collection of poems. I hope it will appear at someday. And I hope it's okay, when it happens, years from now. So thanks for your question. Sorry to not answer, but.
Well, Neil, Sean Hunter has a title for your untitled book. It must remain private at this time by Neil Surkan.
Yeah, perfect.
Well done. That's excellent, Sean.
That is true often of the poems.
That's good. That's excellent. So we'll just do one last poll, see if anybody else wants to ask a question before we sign out here. I was misinformed. The City of Calgary W.O. Mitchell Book Prize will be presented at the 2022 Calgary Awards on June 15th, not in Edmonton. I'm sorry about that. That was my bad misinformation. Any more questions from anybody? How are we feeling there? Julie or Neil, is there anything you'd like to talk about to wrap this up?
I'm just so floored by Julie's and Jaspreet's readings. Thank you for your readings. They were marvelous. So that's all I want to say.
Same. And I'm really sorry that Jaspreet has dropped off into internet oblivion. But yeah, just these books are really beautiful, and it's such a pleasure. And I'm thinking of all of these things that are happening in such a disconnected space. Neil, you're a PhD that didn't get marked. The launches of these books that took place essentially in private confined spaces. So this, hopefully we're getting to a point where we can start to reconvene. Yesterday, I was at my first literary event since the pandemic started in person. So there's light at the end of the tunnel, but I think being able to gather in person is so important for our culture. And I can't wait till we can do it again in person. In the meantime, thank you for those of you who are here. It's a thin substitute, but it at least keeps us connected in the meantime. Thank you.
For sure. Thank you. Thank you, Julie. Thank you, Neil. Thank you, Jaspreet, if you can hear us from the Rocky Mountains. Thank you, everyone who came out this evening. Go find all of these books at Shelf Life. This is a trifecta for language lovers. Thanks to the Writers Guild of Alberta and the City of Calgary. Best of luck to all three of you. Take care, everyone. Good night.